How one frontier family's impossible heating trick saved them from the deadliest winter. The air in the summer of 1886 was thick with smoke. It hung over Montana for months, a gray shroud that turned the sun into a pale disk and made breathing a labor. Great fires had swept the range, consuming everything in their path. Those cattlemen who could find new grass began the move through the haze, their herds stumbling forward like ghosts in a world without color. The grass had begun to die in July, weeks earlier than it should have. All but the largest streams and waterholes dried up. Water in the creeks became so alkaline that cattle refused to drink it, their tongues swollen and cracked from thirst. Heinrich Müller stood at the edge of his homestead, watching the dying land with eyes that had seen this before. Not here, not in Montana, but in the old country, in the stories his grandfather had told him by the light of the Kachelofen on winter nights in Hildesheim, Germany. Stories of winters that came without warning and killed without mercy. Stories of families who survived because they listened to the earth and prepared for what others refused to see. He was 34 years old, a German immigrant who had arrived in Montana Territory in 1883 with his wife Elsbeth and their infant daughter Anna. They had come seeking land, freedom, and the promise of a new life. He had filed his homestead claim on 160 acres of prairie near the confluence of two small creeks, land that his neighbors said was too far from town, too exposed to the wind. But Heinrich had chosen it for the very reasons others avoided it. He could see the weather coming from miles away. He could read the sky like a book written in clouds and wind. And in the fall of 1886, the sky was telling him something terrible. Wild game moved early from its favored shelters in the Missouri Badlands, hurrying south and west. Heinrich watched them pass, deer and elk and antelope, their eyes wide with an ancient fear. Birds which customarily remained all winter fled too, flocks of them, darkening the sky, their calls urgent and shrill. The horses' winter coats appeared earlier than usual, thick and shaggy by September. His own mare, a steady bay, named Greta, had grown a coat so dense he could barely see her skin beneath the fur. Nature had set her stage for the last act. There were other signs, too, signs that only someone who had lived close to the land could read. The beaver lodges along the creek were built higher than usual, their tops rising a full foot above the water line, as if the animals knew the snow would be deep. The bark on the north side of the trees was thicker, rougher, the trees themselves preparing for an onslaught. Even the insects seemed to know. The wasps had built their nests deep in the eaves of the barn, seeking shelter in places they normally avoided. And the ants, those tireless workers, had built their hills higher and steeper, creating fortresses against the coming cold. Heinrich had learned to read these signs from the Blackfeet, who sometimes passed through the territory. They had taught him to watch the animals, to listen to the earth, to understand that nature always gave warnings to those who knew how to see them. The white men, in their arrogance, often dismissed such knowledge as superstition. But Heinrich, who had grown up in a culture that respected the old ways, knew better. The Blackfeet had survived in this land for thousands of years. They knew its moods, its dangers, its secrets. And when they spoke of a winter unlike any other, Heinrich listened. His neighbor, John Patterson, a Scotsman who had been ranching in Montana since 1879, rode over one afternoon in late September. He found Heinrich digging clay from the creek bank, loading it into a wagon with methodical precision. "What in God's name are you doing, Heinrich?" Patterson asked, dismounting and tying his horse to the fence post. "Preparing," Heinrich said simply, not looking up from his work. "Preparing for what? Winter's still months away. We haven't even had the first frost." Heinrich straightened, his back aching from the labor. He gestured to the empty sky with a clay-stained hand. "You see the birds?" "I see they've gone south early." "So what? Maybe they know something we don't." "They do," Heinrich said, his voice quiet but certain. "They know what's coming." Patterson laughed, but there was an edge to it, a nervousness that betrayed his bravado. "You Germans, always worrying, always preparing for the worst. We've had hard winters before. We'll have them again. The cattle will be fine. They always are." Heinrich said nothing. He had learned in his 3 years on the frontier that some men could not be convinced by words. They had to see for themselves. And by then it would be too late. He returned to his digging, the sound of the shovel biting into clay, the only response Patterson received. That night, by the light of a kerosene lamp that cast dancing shadows on the log walls, Heinrich explained his plan to Elsbeth. She was a practical woman, strong and steady, with hands that could birth a calf or bake bread with equal skill. She had been born in Hamburg, the daughter of a baker, and had married Heinrich when she was 19. She listened without interrupting, her face thoughtful, her hands busy with mending. "A Kachelofen," she said when he finished, setting down her needle, "like your grandfather's." "Ja, like his, like the one in our house in Hildesheim. It will take weeks to build, maybe months, and we need to prepare for winter in other ways too. The garden needs to be harvested, the meat needs to be smoked, the root cellar needs to be stocked." "I know," Heinrich said, "but this is the most important thing. Without heat, nothing else matters." She studied his face in the lamplight, seeing the determination there, the certainty that came from some deep well of knowledge she did not fully understand. "And if you're wrong? If the winter is mild?" Heinrich met her eyes, his gaze steady. "Then we will have the finest heating stove in Montana Territory. And our children will never be cold. Not this winter, not any winter." She smiled then, a small smile that held all the trust in the world. "Then we begin tomorrow." Their son, Thomas, had been born in the spring of 1885, a healthy boy with his mother's dark eyes and his father's stubborn chin. Anna, now 3 years old, watched her father with solemn curiosity as he began to transform their small cabin into something that would become legendary. The Kachelofen would be massive. Heinrich had calculated that it would weigh over 1,700 pounds when finished, a mountain of brick and tile and clay that would dominate their single-room home. But it would also be their salvation. He had seen one work in the old country. He had felt its warmth. He knew what it could do. He began with the foundation, digging deep into the earth floor of the cabin and laying a base of flat stones, each one carefully selected for size and stability. The structure had to be stable, able to support the enormous weight above it without settling or cracking. He worked methodically, measuring twice, cutting once, the way his grandfather had taught him in the workshop in Hildesheim, where the old man had built Kachelofens for the wealthy merchants and minor nobility of the region. The core of the Kachelofen was a maze. That was the secret that had been refined over 5 centuries of German engineering. The fire would burn in a small chamber at the base, no larger than 2 feet square. The hot gases would rise through a series of channels, turning and twisting through the mass of fire brick like a river through a canyon. Each turn, each passage would strip more heat from the gases, transferring it to the brick through conduction and radiation. By the time the smoke reached the chimney, it would be barely warm, perhaps 150 degrees Fahrenheit, instead of the 600 degrees that would pour out of a cast-iron stove. All the heat would be trapped inside the stove, radiating slowly outward through the massive thermal mass. He had brought fire brick with him from the east, 200 of them, purchased in St. Paul before they made the final journey to Montana. Each brick had cost him 15 cents, a fortune for a man with limited means. His neighbors had thought him mad for spending money on brick when there was free stone everywhere, when cast-iron stoves could be ordered from the Sears catalog for $12. But Heinrich knew the difference. Fire brick could hold 80% more heat than cast iron. Its thermal conductivity was 1/45 that of steel. A cast-iron stove would burn hot and fast, consuming wood and losing heat up the chimney like water through a sieve. The Kachelofen would burn slow and steady, holding warmth for 6 to 12 hours after the fire died. The construction took him 6 weeks of dawn to dusk labor. He built the firebox first, using the densest fire brick, the ones that could withstand temperatures of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit without cracking. Above the firebox, he constructed the labyrinth, the maze of channels that would capture the heat. He used a technique his grandfather had shown him, creating baffles and turns that forced the hot gases to travel through nearly 20 feet of passage before reaching the chimney, even though the stove itself was only 6 feet tall. He mixed his own mortar, using the clay from the creek bank, sand, and a small amount of lime. The proportions had to be exact. Too much lime, and the mortar would be brittle. Too little, and it would not set properly. He tested each batch, letting it dry and checking its strength before using it in the stove. Around the core of fire brick, he built a shell of common brick, creating an air gap of 2 inches between the 2 layers. This gap would act as additional insulation, preventing heat loss and ensuring that the warmth radiated inward into the cabin rather than outward through the walls. Finally, he surrounded the entire structure with ceramic tiles. He had brought these from Germany, packed carefully in straw, each one a work of art. They were glazed in deep blues and greens, decorated with traditional German patterns of flowers and vines. They were not merely decorative, though they were beautiful. They were functional, acting as a final layer of thermal mass and insulation, holding the heat and radiating it gently into the room. The tiles also kept the surface temperature of the stove below 110 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to warm but not hot enough to burn, safe for children to touch. Elsbeth helped where she could, mixing clay and sand and water into mortar, carrying bricks, keeping Anna and Thomas out from underfoot. Anna, curious and bright, asked endless questions. "Why is it so big, Papa? Why does the smoke go in circles? Will it keep us warm forever?" Heinrich answered each question patiently, teaching her as his grandfather had taught him. "It is big because it needs to hold a lot of heat, little one. The smoke goes in circles so it can give all its warmth to the bricks, and yes, it will keep us warm for a very long time." Thomas, still an infant, watched from his cradle, his eyes following his father's movements with infant fascination. The work consumed him. His hands became a map of his labor, calloused and scarred, the skin cracked and bleeding in places. Elsbeth made salves from rendered fat and herbs, rubbing them into his hands each night, her touch gentle and patient. She never complained about the disruption to their home, never questioned his obsession with this massive structure that was taking over their lives. She had married a man of vision, and she trusted that vision even when she could not fully see where it led. Anna helped in her own way, bringing her father water, singing little songs to keep his spirits up, her voice bright and clear in the dusty cabin. Thomas, now old enough to crawl, explored the growing structure with infant curiosity, his small hands patting the bricks, his face smudged with mortar. The neighbors came to watch, some with curiosity, others with barely concealed amusement. John Patterson brought his wife Mary and their children. "It's quite a contraption, Heinrich," he said, walking around the half-finished structure. "Must be costing you a fortune in time and materials." "It is an investment," Heinrich replied, carefully setting a tile. "In survival." "Survival?" Patterson laughed. "It's just winter, man. We've all survived winters before." Heinrich did not argue. He simply continued his work. On November 16, 1886, the first blizzard struck. It began in the morning, a cold wind from the north that carried the scent of snow and ice. By noon, the sky had turned the color of iron, dark and heavy and oppressive. By evening, the world had disappeared into a maelstrom of white. The Cree had a word for it. Kissin I uwe o. It blows cold. The wind howled like a living thing, a beast of ice and fury. It was not just sound. It had substance. It was filled with glassy particles of snow, like flakes of mica, sharp enough to cut exposed skin. It roared and rumbled, shaking the cabin to its foundations. After the first day, the tonal pitch rose. From a roar, it became a moan, then a scream, a sound that seemed to come from the depths of hell itself. The snow rode the wind. It thrust forward fiercely and slashed like a knife. No garment or hide could withstand it. The gale piled it into glacial drifts, some reaching 15 feet high. When cow or horse stumbled into them, the flesh on its legs was sheared to the bone. Inside the Müller cabin, Heinrich lit the first fire in the Kachelofen. He used small pieces of wood, kindling, and split pine, building the fire slowly and carefully, the way his grandfather had taught him. The flames caught and grew, dancing in the firebox with a cheerful crackle that seemed defiant in the face of the storm outside. He closed the iron door and adjusted the damper, controlling the flow of air with precision. The fire burned hot and bright, and the smoke rose through the maze of channels, surrendering its heat to the waiting brick with each twist and turn. Within an hour, the surface of the Kachelofen was warm to the touch. Within 2 hours, it was radiating a gentle, steady heat that filled the cabin like an invisible blanket. The temperature inside rose to a comfortable 65 degrees, even as the wind outside screamed and the snow piled against the walls and the thermometer on the porch read 22 degrees below zero. Elsbeth stood with her hands on the tiles, feeling the warmth seep into her bones, feeling the tension drain from her shoulders. "It works," she whispered, her voice filled with wonder and relief. "Ja," Heinrich said, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "It works." The fire burned for 3 hours, consuming less wood than their old cast-iron stove would have used in 1 hour. Then Heinrich let it die, closing the damper completely and sealing the firebox. The Kachelofen continued to radiate heat, all through the night, all through the next day. For 12 hours, the cabin remained warm, the massive thermal mass of the stove releasing its stored energy in a slow, controlled flow that seemed almost miraculous. Their neighbors were not so fortunate. John Patterson and his family huddled around their cast-iron stove, feeding it constantly, watching their woodpile shrink with each passing hour. The stove burned hot, but the heat rose straight up and out the chimney, wasted on the frozen sky. The cabin was cold except in the immediate vicinity of the stove. They wore coats indoors. They slept in layers of blankets. And still they shivered, their breath visible in the frigid air. The blizzard lasted 3 days. When it finally passed, the landscape was transformed. Snow lay in drifts 15 feet high, sculpted by the wind into fantastic shapes. The temperature had dropped to 22 below zero and showed no signs of rising. Cattle stood frozen in the fields, their bodies encased in ice, monuments to the fury of the storm. There was a brief respite. The temperature moderated slightly, rising to a balmy 10 below. The stockmen prayed for the Chinook, the warm wind from the west that could melt snow and save cattle. The wind the Indians called the Black Wind. But it was too early in the season. The Chinook did not come. The drifts dwindled but did not disappear. They spread, crusting the range with a layer of ice that made it impossible for cattle to reach the grass beneath. In December there were 2 more blizzards, each one worse than the last. Heinrich continued his routine with the discipline of a monk. 1 fire a day in the morning just after dawn. 3 hours of burning using small pieces of wood, never more than necessary. 12 hours of warmth, sometimes more if the weather was not too severe. His woodpile, carefully cut and stacked and covered with canvas, barely diminished. He had calculated his needs with German precision estimating that he would need 1/3 the wood that a cast iron stove would require. While his neighbors scrambled to find more fuel, venturing out into the deadly cold to chop frozen trees, Heinrich had time to do other things. He repaired harnesses. He carved toys for the children, little wooden horses and dolls. He read to Elsbeth from the Bible by the light of the lamp, his voice a comfort in the long, dark nights. January arrived like an executioner. The moon of cold, exploding trees, the Blackfeet called it, because the sap in the trees would freeze and expand, causing the trunks to split with sounds like gunshots on the head. 9th day of that month, it snowed without an instant's interruption for 16 hours. An inch an hour, 1.5 feet of new snow on top of what was already there. The temperature fell to 22 below zero. Intermittent snow continued for another 10 days, with temperatures ranging from 22 to 46 below in central Montana. In some sections, it was 40 below day in and day out for more than 2 weeks. The cold was not just cold, it was a physical force, a presence that seemed to have weight and malice. And then, on January 28, 1887, the great blizzard struck. For 3 days and 3 nights, it was impossible to see 50 feet in any direction. The world became a white void, a screaming emptiness. Ranch thermometers read 63 below zero. Some claimed it was colder, that the mercury had frozen in the glass, that the true temperature was closer to 70 below. A sudden break in the cold and a wind shift gave promise of a Chinook, but the storm set in again and lasted through February 3rd. A rider who dismounted dropped into snow to his waist on level ground. Men who ventured outside to tend to livestock returned with frostbite so severe their fingers and toes turned black and had to be amputated. Cattle, which had been pushed over the Missouri in the fall to the better grass on the northern range, drifted back, for there was little shelter on the steppes north of the river. Half dead from cold and hunger, their bodies covered with sores and frozen blood, their eyes crusted shut with ice, bewildered and blind in a world of impenetrable white, they blundered into barbed wire fences, crumpled against them, and perished. They were trapped in drifts above their bellies and stood erect until their bodies froze solid, grotesque statues that would not thaw until spring. They slid into air holes in the rivers and drowned, their bodies washing up miles downstream when the ice finally broke. Cowboys donned 2 suits of heavy underwear, 2 pairs of wool socks, wool pants, 2 woolen shirts, overalls, leather chaps, wool gloves under leather mittens, blanket-lined overcoats, and fur caps. Before putting on the socks, they walked in the snow in their bare feet, then rubbed them dry vigorously, a technique learned from the Indians to prevent frostbite. After pulling on their riding boots, they stood in water, then stood outdoors, until an airtight sheath of ice had formed on the boots, creating a waterproof barrier. Thus prepared, they mounted their horses and fought their way through the snow to extricate cattle stuck in drifts, tried to herd the dying beasts into sheltered ravines, and head them off from treacherous rivers. They blacked their faces and eye sockets with lampblack or burnt matches to forestall snow blindness, giving them the appearance of raccoons or demons. They strained and gasped as the icy air stabbed into their lungs and stomachs like knives. They froze hands and feet. Many of them died. Their bodies, frozen stiff, were lashed on the tuoman, backs of their horses, and borne back to the ranch houses to be thrust into a snowbank until a Chinook came because the ground could not be broken for graves. The earth was frozen solid to a depth of 6 feet. For all this, they got no medals, nor expected any. A cowboy's job was to look after the herd. He was being paid for it, $40 a month. But hundreds of ranchers and riders underwent such hardships in that dreadful winter that they forsook the range forever, crippled in body and spirit, haunted by memories of the cold and the dying cattle and the endless white. On the morning of February 1st, 1887, there was a knock on the Müller's door. Heinrich opened it to find John Patterson standing in the snow, his face gray with cold and exhaustion, his eyes hollow. Behind him were his wife Mary and their 3 children, the youngest an infant wrapped in blankets that were stiff with frost. "Heinrich," Patterson said, his voice cracking, barely more than a whisper. "We're out of wood. The children, they're sick. Mary's hands are frostbitten. I don't know what to do. I don't know where else to go." Heinrich stepped aside without hesitation. "Come in, quickly." They stumbled into the cabin, and the warmth hit them like a physical force, like walking into a wall. Mary Patterson began to cry, great heaving sobs of relief and gratitude and shame. The children stared at the Kachelofen with wonder, their small hands reaching out to touch the warm tiles, their faces transforming from masks of misery to expressions of awe. "How?" Patterson asked, his voice breaking. "How is it so warm in here? It's like summer." Heinrich gestured to the stove, the massive structure that dominated the room. "The Kachelofen." "I tried to tell you." Patterson's face crumpled. "I'm sorry. I should have listened. I should have believed you. I thought you were crazy, building this thing, wasting your time. But you were right. God help me, you were right." "It doesn't matter now," Heinrich said, placing a hand on the man's shoulder. "You're here. You're safe. That's all that matters." Elsbeth was already moving, setting out bowls of soup made from potatoes and salted pork, wrapping blankets around the shivering children, examining Mary's frostbitten hands with gentle efficiency. The cabin, designed for a family of 4, now held 8. It was crowded, but it was warm, and warmth in that winter was life itself. Over the next week, more families arrived, appearing out of the storm like refugees from a war. The Johnsons, who had lost their entire herd of 200 cattle. The O'Briens, whose cabin had partially collapsed under the weight of snow, the roof caving in and nearly killing them. The Schmidts, fellow Germans who had not believed that the old ways could work in the New World, who had laughed at Heinrich's Kachelofen and bought a modern cast-iron stove from the Sears catalog instead. The Müller cabin became a refuge, a sanctuary in a frozen hell. At its peak, it sheltered 14 people, their bodies packed together on the floor at night like sardines in a tin. They slept in shifts. They shared what little food they had, rationing it carefully, making every potato and every strip of dried meat count. And at the center of it all, the Kachelofen radiated its steady, life-saving warmth, the heart of their survival. Heinrich's carefully calculated wood supply began to dwindle. He had planned for his family, not for an entire community. But he could not turn people away. He could not condemn them to death. He rationed the fires, burning only once every 2 days instead of once a day. The cabin grew cooler, dropping from 65 degrees to 55, then to 50. But it was still far warmer than anywhere else, still survivable when the world outside was a frozen wasteland. The food situation became critical. Elsbeth's carefully preserved stores of potatoes, carrots, onions, and salted pork were disappearing at an alarming rate. The children, 8 of them now, were always hungry, their eyes following every movement of food with desperate intensity. The adults gave them the largest portions and made do with less, their own stomachs growling, their own bodies growing thin. On February 12th, the temperature in Bismarck, North Dakota, was recorded at 43 below zero. In Montana, it was likely colder, though few thermometers could measure it accurately. The storm showed no signs of abating. The snow continued to fall. The wind continued to howl. Men began to wonder if winter would ever end, if this was the new reality, if the world had entered a new ice age. Heinrich stood outside one morning, his face wrapped in a scarf, his eyes scanning the white horizon. He had never seen anything like this. Even in the old country, even in the worst winters his grandfather had described, Winters that had killed thousands in the harsh German countryside, there had been breaks in the weather. Periods of calm, days when the sun emerged and the world remembered what warmth felt like. This was different. This was relentless. This was a winter that wanted to kill, that seemed to have a malevolent intelligence, a cruel purpose. He thought of his grandfather, the Hofnermeister, the master builder of Kachelofen, who had served the wealthy families of Hildesheim for 40 years. He had died when Heinrich was 12, but his lessons had remained, carved into Heinrich's memory like words in stone. "The stove is not just a tool," he had said, his gnarled hands resting on the warm tiles of his masterpiece. "It is a covenant. You feed it, and it feeds you. You respect it, and it respects you. And when the world outside is trying to kill you, it will keep you alive. Remember that, boy. Remember it always." Heinrich had not fully understood then. He understood now. He went back inside, shook the snow from his coat, and knelt beside the Kachelofen. He opened the firebox and laid the fire with care, using the smallest pieces of wood, making every stick count. The flames caught and grew, dancing with a life that seemed precious and fragile in the face of the cold outside. The heat began to build, flowing through the maze of channels, warming the brick, warming the tiles, warming the air, warming the people who depended on it. And once again, the stove fulfilled its covenant. The efficiency of the Kachelofen was something that had to be experienced to be believed. A cast-iron stove might consume 20 pounds of wood in a day, burning hot and fast, wasting heat up the chimney. The Kachelofen used 6 pounds of wood to produce the same amount of warmth over the same period. It was a difference that meant survival. Heinrich had calculated that his woodpile, which would have lasted a month with a cast-iron stove, would last the entire winter with the Kachelofen. And he had been right, but it was more than just efficiency. It was the quality of the heat. Cast-iron stoves produced radiant heat that was intense and localized. You could be burning on one side and freezing on the other. The Kachelofen produced a gentle, even warmth that filled the entire space, radiating from the massive surface area of the tiles. It was the difference between standing next to a bonfire and sitting in a warm room. It was the difference between survival and comfort. The science behind it was elegant. The maze of channels inside the stove created what engineers would later call a counterflow heat exchanger. The hot gases from the fire rose through the channels, transferring their heat to the surrounding brick through conduction. As the gases cooled, they became denser and began to sink, creating a natural circulation that drew fresh hot gases up from the fire. This process continued until the gases had given up nearly all their heat, exiting the chimney at a temperature barely above ambient. The thermal mass of the brick and tile then acted as a battery, storing the heat and releasing it slowly over time. The surface temperature of the stove would peak at around 110 degrees Fahrenheit about 2 hours after the fire was lit, then slowly decline over the next 10 to 12 hours, maintaining a comfortable room temperature throughout. The worst moment came on February 14, 1887. Valentine's Day, though no one was thinking of romance or love or anything but survival. The wind reached a pitch that sounded like the screaming of the damned, a sound that seemed to come from the bowels of the earth. The cabin shook on its foundations. Snow forced its way through cracks in the walls, forming small drifts inside, white fingers reaching into their sanctuary. The temperature outside was estimated at 70 below zero, though no thermometer could measure it. It was cold beyond cold, cold beyond comprehension, cold that could freeze flesh in seconds, cold that could stop a man's heart mid-beat. Inside the cabin, 14 people huddled together, their bodies pressed close for warmth. The children whimpered. The adults prayed, their lips moving in silent supplication. And the Kachelofen, That massive mountain of brick and tile radiated its warmth with the steadiness of a beating heart. The surface temperature of the stove was 110 degrees Fahrenheit. The air in the cabin was 50 degrees. It was not comfortable, but it was survivable, and that was all that mattered. Survival. One more day. One more hour. One more breath. The storm broke on February 15th. The wind died as suddenly as it had begun. The snow stopped. The temperature began slowly to rise. On February 20th, a Chinook finally arrived, the warm wind from the west that the Indians called the Black Wind because it emerged from an arch of black cloud on the western horizon. It swept across the plains like a blessing, melting snow, raising the temperature by 50 degrees in a matter of hours, transforming the landscape from winter to spring in the span of a single day. The survivors emerged from their shelters to survey the damage. It was catastrophic. The landscape was littered with the frozen carcasses of cattle, thousands of them, tens of thousands, their bodies revealed as the snow melted. In some areas, losses reached 95%. Nelson's story of Bozeman, the legendary cattleman who 20 years before had brought the first trail herd from Texas to Montana, lost more than 66% of his stock, over 4,000 head. On the Yellowstone Range, entire herds had been wiped out. The Homeland and Cattle Company had put 6,000 head across the Canadian border in the fall, seeking better grass. Only 2,000 survived. James Fergus, another prominent rancher, sold 1,500 hides from his dead stock for $2,000, a fraction of what the living cattle would have been worth. As the storms and cold had continued through February, the tragedy of the range had been brought into the towns. Starving cattle staggered through village streets, their ribs showing through their hides, collapsed and died in dooryards. 5,000 head invaded the outskirts of the newborn city of Great Falls, bawling for food, their cries echoing through the streets. They snatched up the saplings the proud city had just planted, gorged themselves upon garbage, ate anything they could find. The winter of 1886 to 1887 became known as the Big Die-Up. It was the end of the open range, the end of an era of reckless expansion and blind faith in the abundance of the land. Eastern and foreign investors lost interest and thrust their companies into bankruptcy. The big herds had nearly vanished. In Custer County, Montana, the tax rolls in 1886 listed 200 ranchers. In 1888, the total was 120. 80 men had been driven out of business, their dreams destroyed, their fortunes lost. But in a small cabin near the confluence of two creeks, a family and their neighbors had survived. They had survived because of an impossible heating trick, technology that was centuries old, a covenant between man and fire and stone that had been forged in the workshops of Germany and brought to the Montana frontier by a man who had the wisdom to listen and the courage to prepare. Word spread quickly. By the spring of 1887, Heinrich Müller was the most sought-after man in Montana Territory. Ranchers and homesteaders came from miles around, some traveling for days, asking him to teach them how to build a Kachelofen. He did, patiently, carefully, passing on the knowledge his grandfather had given him, the knowledge that had saved his life and the lives of those he sheltered. Over the next decade, masonry heaters began to appear across the frontier. They were not all Kachelofens, not all built in the German style, but they all shared the same principle: massive thermal mass, efficient combustion, slow, steady release of heat. They were a fusion of old-world engineering and new-world necessity, a reminder that sometimes the most innovative solutions are the ones that have been with us all along, waiting to be remembered. Heinrich Müller never became wealthy. He remained a homesteader, working his 160 acres, raising his children, living quietly and without fanfare. But he was respected. He was the man who had listened when others would not, the man who had prepared when others had scoffed, the man who had saved lives with an impossible heating trick. When he died in 1912 at the age of 60, his funeral was attended by over 200 people, many of whom owed their lives to him and the knowledge he had shared. In 1956, Montana recorded its coldest temperature ever documented in the lower 48 states, 70 degrees below zero, north of Helena, near Rogers Pass. But by then, the lessons of 1886 to 1887 had been learned and taken to heart. People were prepared. They had insulation, they had food stores, they had heating systems that could withstand the worst that winter could throw at them. And in some homes, in some corners of Montana, there were still Kachelofen, massive and beautiful, radiating their gentle warmth, keeping the covenant that Heinrich Müller's grandfather had spoken of so many years before in a workshop in Hildesheim, Germany. The story of the Big Die-Up is a story of hubris and humility, of nature's power and human resilience. It is a story that reminds us that the frontier was not conquered by strength alone, but by wisdom, by the willingness to listen to the whispers of the natural world, by the courage to prepare for what others refuse to see, and by the knowledge, passed down through generations, that sometimes survival depends not on what is new and modern, but on what has been forgotten and dismissed. In the heart of that deadliest of winters, it was a simple, elegant, and almost forgotten technology that made all the difference. A Kachelofen, a tiled stove, a covenant between fire and stone, and the family that believed in it when no one else would, that built it. When others mocked, that shared its warmth when others needed it most. That is the legacy of Heinrich Müller. That is the story of how one frontier family's impossible heating trick saved them from the deadliest winter in American history.